Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to the Booms and Bus Show. My name is Jonathan Davis, and today's show I think will be somewhat more serious than previously. Doesn't mean there won't be any levity, because on this week in history, in fact on the 27th of January 1945, we saw the liberation of Auschwitz, Birkenau, and the 27th of January is, of course, the Holocaust Memorial Day. If you look at Amnesty International's homepage, what do you think is the image? As someone quite acutely says on Twitter, do you think it's Syria's killing of 500,000 Syrians, or more to the point, the ISIS guys killing hundreds of thousands of Syrians? How about the Saudis killing 10,000 Yemenis? No, it's not one of those. It's not the people who are enslaved in Saudi Arabia. It's not the slaves in Palestine by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or Hamas as they call themselves these days. No, it says Free Ahed Tamimi, who said on video, whether it is stabbings or martyrdom operations, as in what she means is suicide bombings, or throwing stones, everyone must do his part. That's on the homepage of Amnesty International. Today in history, or this week in history, in 1571, this is after all the Booms and Bus Show, and we look at economics, look at markets, as well as politics. In 1571, the Royal Exchange opened in London. So that is, of course, over, over 400 years, nearly 450 years ago, you had in effect stock trading formalised in England 450 years ago. Isn't that amazing? And for every single one of those 450 years, the city and Wall Street has been screwing the people, and they continue to get away with it. Isn't that amazing? 73 years ago, the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp was liberated. 27th of January. If you go on to the Booms and Bus Show Twitter feed, which is at Boomsbusts Show, and I ask you to do so this week in particular, go to the pinned tweet and scroll down, and you'll see horrendous photos from the Holocaust. The first one is quite poignant for what is essentially a financial podcast. Look at all the hundreds and hundreds of gold wedding rings that were pillaged from those who were massacred. You think it was about racism? No, that was the symptom. It was about money and power first. Look at this next picture. It shows a trench, I would say about 40 yards long by about 10 yards wide. And it shows hundreds of dead, naked bodies with a couple of guys walking over them, no doubt seeing if they could fit more into the trench, and German Nazis and their guns above. The next photo is about 15 or 20 Nazis. They'd call themselves German soldiers, looking at another German soldier, Nazi, pointing a Luger at a Jewish man's brain, while the Jewish man stands atop a pit, and in the pit are a dozen dead bodies, and it's obvious what's going to happen next. At Holocaust Memorial Week, I think it's pertinent to point out that according to studies, only 54% of the world has heard of the Holocaust. And 34% of the world believes that the Holocaust is a myth. Holocaust. Whole, entire. Cost. Fire, inferno. Poland's lower house of parliament, equivalent to the House of Representatives and the House of Commons in the UK, they've just approved a bill criminalising the acknowledgement of Poland's complicity in the Holocaust. They've approved a bill criminalising acknowledging Polish complicity in the Holocaust. This law is our regular reminder, one of our regular reminders, that those who tell you that anti-Semitism isn't systemic or structural know nothing about anti-Semitism as it is or was, and they are aiding and abetting the apologists. And it makes me think of a couple of things. You know, you've heard the phrase, no doubt, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. How about adding, yet those who do study history are doomed to stand by helplessly while everyone else repeats it? I'm reminded as well about Niemöller's poem that he wrote in the 1940s. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. I'll come back to that in a moment. In this week of remembering the Holocaust, the Labour Party in the United Kingdom directs its MPs to reject a call to ban the terrorist group Hezbollah. They told their MPs to reject the call to ban Hezbollah.
I always get thrown this question about Venezuela. To be frank, it's not that the issue is socialism versus capitalism. In terms of what happened in Venezuela, they took a wrong turn. And they took a wrong turn because all the objectives of Chavez in terms of tackling inequality, investing in education, developing people's skills, I think would have been successful if they had actually mobilized the oil resources to actually invest in the long term. And yes, working with private sector as well, invest in the long term. And it's interesting, they should have learnt the lessons of the UK as well, because we squandered our oil resources as well. We allowed private profit to take the benefits of that, rather than as in Norway, where they set up a sovereign wealth fund. So I think in Venezuela they took a wrong turn. and not a particularly effective path and not a socialist path. But I say it's the comparison with what happened to the oil revenues of Britain and looking back now about what we could have done with those oil revenues, building up a sovereign wealth fund as Norway did, and that we could invest in our public services. So I think there's lessons to be learned on the mistakes that have been made all round.
That was John McDonnell at Davos. I'm so inspired, by the way, by what these guys are doing up in the Swiss mountains. I've changed my name. My name is now Jonathan Davos. They're so inspirational. John McDonnell is what they call the shadow chancellor, which means he's in the party, the biggest party that's not in government in the UK, and he's trying to become the finance minister for the country. He is an avowed Marxist, and he absolutely believes in the state controlling everything, including, of course, the people. And there in Davos, he is telling the assembled throng that the reason why Venezuela has utterly failed, not for the elite, of course, just for the bottom 90%, who are literally starving, Venezuelans are starving. This is the country that's got more oil in it than any country in the world. Venezuela has more oil than any country in the world, and 90% of its population are starving. And John McDonnell's reasons, because the socialism that they've done has not been enough. They need more socialism. I'd like to add or alter Niemöller's poem. They came for the socialists and I said nothing because they damn well deserved it. The next time you hear a total utter numpty telling you that Nazism was A, worse than socialism, communism, and B, different, just remember, and I go to one of my quotes of the week, Adolf Hitler, 1927, May the 1st, we are socialists. We are enemies of today's capitalistic economic system. You think the Holocaust came about because of what Wall Street did to Germany? Yes, we know that the reparations from World War I demanded were huge. Yes, we know. It put Germany into a terrible financial state. We know that. They were already in a bad one in 1918. No. The reason we got Nazism and Kristallnacht and the concentration camps and eugenics and fascism and the Holocaust was because the German people supported the Central Bank of Germany, the Reichsbank, from printing money hand over fist. They couldn't handle the idea that they would have a lower standard of living. So instead of cutting their cloth to suit their circumstances, they voted in again and again the people who printed and printed and printed. And from 1919 to 1923, inflation in Weimar Germany went from 4% to 4,000%. billion%. The worst hyperinflation in the history of the human race. And as a result, the people's standard of living went to the floor and all the way through to Australia. So they had to blame someone, didn't they? And they thought, well, I'm a Catholic, I'm a this, I'm a that. This guy's saying blame the Jews. Yeah, let's take their jobs. Let's take their businesses. Let's take their gold from their fingers and from their teeth. Because the guys in Wall Street did this to us. And there's many Jews, aren't there? So it must have been the same Jews in Germany. My neighbours, whom I went to school with, who my kids went to school with, it must have been their fault. The guy I work next to, he runs a kosher butcher shop, and I've got the non-kosher butcher shop. It must have been his fault. Don't tell me it was the 1%, the SS, who did it. They didn't do it on their own. The German people did this. Because there's no way on earth that 1 or 2% of the population could have got away with this without the tacit acceptance and instruction from the bulk of the rest. On a slightly lighter note, let us turn to capitalism, the thing where you never see people fleeing from, do you? In capitalism, you see people with big bellies and smiles on their faces and great lifestyles. And you get people demonstrating on the streets. Not in socialism. Not in communism, not in Nazism, not in fascism. Only in capitalism. And only in capitalism can you put your hand in your pocket and pull out all of the world's knowledge. Can you speak to someone 10,000 miles away? Can you see their faces while you speak to them? Can you shop from Hong Kong and have it delivered to your door at 1/3 of the price than if you drive 5 miles to the nearest department store? Only in capitalism can you do this. And the photo that you see there is a much easier photo to look at. What is it? That, listener, is a photo from 1956. And it's IBM. And what actually is that piano-sized contraption? It's 5 megabytes of RAM. 5 megabytes. And over the next 60 years, you know how much that's come down in size. And you know how much computing power you now have. I've just ordered another couple of PCs, laptops for my firm. 16 gigabyte of RAM. 16 gigabyte! It doesn't even compare. If only we had capitalism, listener. Because you know what? In the last 10 years of socialism, you think we've had capitalism, then you've been listening to the wrong show for weeks or months. We do not have capitalism. We have socialism. How else can you describe the planned economy of what the central banks are doing in terms of printing money, in terms of interest rates, in terms of bailing out any business that they want to bail out with our kids' and grandkids' money? If that isn't socialism, tell me what the hell socialism is. In the last 10 years, the United States has had real, as in inflation-adjusted GDP of merely 1.4% per annum. This is the worst average decade in US history because of socialism. Talking of capitalism, I see that arguably the most successful furniture salesman in the world has just died. The chap who at the age of 17 founded the amazing business IKEA, and it became the world's largest retailer, and the guy died worth, depending on whose reports you read, 20 or 60 billion dollars. Well done to him. I gather it's taking his family a week to put together his coffin. I read in the public press that they want us to believe that in the UK we might have 3 base rate rises this year. Well, Mark Carney, as I've said to you before, is the governor of the Bank of England. Before that, he was the governor of the Bank of Canada. Mark Carney has only once in his nearly 10 years now of being governor of a major central bank, he has only once raised the interest rate. And that was at the end of 2017 when he had to reverse the cut that he made from 0.5% to 0.25% post-Brexit, because he had to save face, because he said in the Brexit referendum, if you vote yes, it'll kill our economy. It didn't kill the economy, and he still cut the interest rate. Well, he had to reverse it. He had no alternative. And he will fight tooth and nail, as he has done for 10 years, to raise interest rates. There will come a point, and we're probably at it as it happens, when he can no longer avoid raising the rate. 3 rate rises this year, that would be optimistic. 1 or 2 is more likely the case. But the bigger picture, listener, is the question that I've been posing for months, indeed for about a year now. Have we ended the 40-plus year descent of inflation and interest rates? Have we now entered a probably 20-year era of rising inflation and rising interest rates? I say we have, very probably. Not saying for certain, because I don't know the future. The future, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. Yogi Berra. But on the basis that interest rates are no longer falling, as they have done for 40-plus years, that in itself takes away the tailwind that the housing market has had for 40-plus years. Simply that rates are no longer falling. Now, they still might be. We don't know it for sure. What we know is, as I've been talking a lot in the last few months, is that long-term government borrowing rates have risen dramatically since the summer of 2016. That's getting on for 2 years now. As we speak, the US 10-year yield has broken 1.7%. That is huge, huge, huge resistance on a 20, 30-year falling downtrend. Now, it would have to breach 1.7 and close that way at the end of the day on Friday. So let's see what happens this week, but it could be a huge, huge week for the world for the next 10 or 20 years. A move from disinflation to inflation would be absolutely gigantic. Of course, rising interest rates are going to affect mortgagees, those who are mortgaged, borrowers, in other words. Not if you got a fixed, but when you come to the end of that fix, yes, you're going to be affected. And these things take time to play out in the real economy. But if you've got a 2, 3, 5 year fix and long-term rates are rising, I'm telling you, you will be affected. You will have to pay materially more when you come out of that fix. And that will affect hundreds of thousands, millions of folk in the UK alone who are up to their eyeballs in debt. And so the long-term outlook for house prices is not positive, to put it mildly. And I read that in London, the developers started on 1,900 apartments and have only been able to sell 900 of them, according to property data experts Molly or London, whoever they are. I wonder why it is they can't sell them, because the average sale price for a 3-bedroom apartment is £3 million. Why is it they can't sell? Because £3 million, £1 million a bedroom, it's dirt cheap. What's the problem? It's only £1 million a bedroom. They've got to be crazy. And the pundits and the media ask, why aren't these properties selling? For goodness sake. What else do I read? Of course, they're trying to blame it on Brexit. Give me strength. Right, economics. There's a chart of IHS Market Purchases Managers Index, composite as in services and manufacturing, as well as Eurozone GDP. Sorry, the market PMIs for Eurozone. And the blue line is the PMIs and the grey bar charts are GDP. PMIs are the highest since 2007, the highest in over 10 years. GDP is the highest since 2014. The idea that the European Central Bank will for much longer hold on to its ridiculous, corrupt, negative interest rate, well, it doesn't wash. Eurozone rates are going to rise and they will reduce quantitative easing. This confirms inflation. It might be dodgy for the stock market, but then again it might not. I'm not saying it will be. I'm just saying look out for it. But the reason why it might be positive for the stock market as it happens is because as long-term interest rates rise, investors will be selling government bonds left, right and centre. And they're going to put the money somewhere. They're going to put it into commodities. They're also going to put it into the stock market. Probably. People do crazy things when they forget about things like recessions. And there is a chart of what we call underwater car loans in the United States. right up to the end of 2017. And what it is showing is the percentage of trade-ins to buy a new car, but the trade-ins with negative equity. In other words, they owe more on the car than the car is worth. And astonishingly, a third of trade-ins are in negative equity. And people would rather get a new car than pay off the loan. They're just mad because they're exchanging it with another higher loan and another depreciating so-called asset. What was it George Carlin said? Think of how stupid the average person is and realise half of them are stupider than that. Moving on to the markets. This is now confirmed, and I talked about it in the very first show in 2018, early January. We now have the longest streak in history for the S&P 500 without a 5% correction. It tops the previous record from the mid-1990s. And to add to this, it's now 5 months since the S&P had its last 2% daily correction. No, 2% correction. 15 months since it had a 3% correction, and indeed 19 months since it had a 5% correction. These are all records. When you read and hear people saying the market is topping, do us a favour, throw a tomato at them. This is not bearish action, listener. And if you're not heavily invested in your pension, in your ISAs, in the risk markets, in commodities, you'll regret it big time. Indeed, I bet you've already regretted it through the whole of 2017 when I was telling you all about this stuff. How much did you have in government bonds? Too much, I imagine. There is a chart which comes from Thomson Reuters, which has been displayed by top-down charts. And it shows the price earnings valuation rankings across markets. There's about 30 markets there. And I want to point out two things. The US is, according to historical norms, hugely overpriced with a ratio of 31.7. Massive. And you talk to any of the Nobel Prize winners, you talk to Warren Buffett and all the rest of it, and they'll say, that's a joke. It's going to crash. Well, that's great. In that time that they've been saying it's going to crash, the Dow went up 200%. Amazon went up 1,000%, and so on. I went through it with you last week, listener. The price earnings is a joke. Forget it. No one cares. I will point out something else to you. Greece, according to this calculation, is by far the cheapest of those 30 or 40 country markets at a price earnings of merely 3.1. You take from it what you will. And to show you how ridiculous the 31.7 for the US is, and by the way, the table's there, you just keep on scrolling, you'll see it. At 31.7, look at the S&P for the last 5 years. And we had something of a bear market in 2015, early 16. And if you were listening to my podcasts in early 16 from another place, and by the way, you know the guy I'm talking about when I talk about the other place. Small, fat, aggressive, arrogant, beyond belief. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. The business is no longer. He's just been ousted as a director of the business. Someone tweeted me the statement from the company's house or whatever. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. And then you see the stock market really taking off from early 16. But look at the last monthly bar, January 18, and this in fact takes us to the close on Friday. Of course, we've still got today, Tuesday and Wednesday. Do you know what? I've just realised I didn't say what date it is. Today's Monday the 29th of January 2018. Apologies. Look at the bar there. That is a huge positive bar. That is not a bearish action of the stock market. And look at this nearly 120-year chart of the Dow Jones Industrial Average Index. In other words, the Dow. Do you think 120 years is sufficient data for us to make some conclusions and thinking as to what might happen going forward? I think 120 years is indeed sufficient data. You can see how in the 1920s the stock market soared and then it collapsed. And it basically did nothing for, about 15 years. And then it soared into the early 60s. And then it did nothing until the early 80s. And then it soared until the late 90s. And then it did nothing for the next 15 years. And then it has been soaring. I contend that whether it's from 2015 when it broke 2017 when it broke the 2015, 2007 and 2000 highs, or whether it's from 2009, I contend that we are in a very long-term bull market for developed and indeed emerging stock markets, similar to the early 80s to 2000, similar to the mid-40s to the mid-60s. Depending on your point of view, we've had 1 year or we've had 8 or 9 years. So we could have another 10 or 20 years. We've already had 5 years of people telling us the market's too high and it's going to crash. 5 years. Stop listening to them. Start making some money. Stop paying them subscriptions. Gold is very interesting. Very, very interesting indeed. I repeat, while it's above circa $13.10 dollars per ounce, you're bullish. You have to be bullish. And it's good to about $13.90 or the low 1400s. From 12.50 in December of 17, we're looking at $140, $150 rise, which is 10 to 15%. But that's going to be the first stage. There will be a correction, maybe back down to the mid 1300s, 1330, you got to stay bullish, because the next stage is 15 to 1550. And all the while, we've had gold miners, and particularly junior miners, soaring since mid-December. Interestingly, they've not been soaring as much as you'd expect, but that's exactly what happened in the mini bull of December 15 to the summer of 16. Gold started first, then silver, then major miners, then junior miners. By the end of it, junior miners were up over 150% in like 7 or 8 months. Above 1310, you've got to be bullish. And look at this as well. People say gold's still in a bear market. As it happens, it's possible. It needs to get above certainly the high of the summer of 16, which was 1370, 1380. It needs to get above that and stay above. It can come back below, but that's fine. But it needs to get above and stay above. But listen to this. In the bear market, bottoming in December, January of 1516, gold bottomed at 1050. After the mini bull, we had the fall, the crash in late 16. It went down to 1150. It then petered around, it went up, went down, went up and down. It bottomed in December 17 at 1250. December 15, 1050. December 16, 1150. December 17, 1250. This is not bearish behavior, folks. Yes, I am bullish gold. I'm uber bullish junior gold miners. And I'm glad to say that the Junior Gold Miners Fund that we use is doing great guns compared to the JDXJ, which is the biggest junior miners index. Yes, lovely jubbly. 1310. That's what all you need to know. If we're above it, you need to be bullish. Forget what he says and she says. Above 1310, you have to be bullish. Below 1300, sure, you can take it off. Is this advice? No, it's not. Just saying what I see on the charts. But if we are above 1310 and you want to get in, what on earth are you waiting for? Now, every 2 months, I do what's called the Booms and Busts report, which is an emailed document putting some meat on the bones. If you want to get it free, and by the way, please know categorically, you will never be junk mailed because your email address will never leave my office. Send me your name and your email address to jd@theboomsandbustsshow.com. jd@theboomsandbustsshow.com. And over the next few days, week or so, I will be sending out the next Booms and Busts report, which of course associates with this show. You'll have seen on Twitter, as you're looking at the pictures, incidentally, someone who has listened to practically every show that I've ever done was not until recently a follower on Twitter. So I ask you, if you're not following me on Twitter and yet you are a Twitterer, go on to Booms Bust Show, click to follow. Secondly, the easiest way to access this podcast is to go to the pinned tweet and simply click the audio boom link and then play. And I suggest you have your listening device and you have another device that you can actually look at the pictures, the photos and the charts. Because I don't think you'll be able to use your phone to listen and to look at. Maybe you can, I just don't know how to. You might need a phone and a tablet, or a phone and a PC, or two of those three. If you could also rate, you'll see a link to iTunes. I'd be most appreciative, because that's one of the main ways that other people who have never heard of the Booms and Bust Show will get to know of the Booms and Bust Show. And I get a feeling from listeners, from followers on Twitter, that you do want other people to know about this show. So please, simply click on iTunes and simply rate, out of 5 stars, rate the show. I want to thank sincerely, I'm just checking my phone right now to see what the scores and the doors are. I want to thank sincerely the listeners who retweeted the show over the last week. Until last week's show, the record was 17 retweets of the show. And this week, or for show number 40, should I say, 23 of you retweeted the show. Now, if you look at it, you'll see 25. But that's because my two accounts, one of them being Booms Bust Show, the other one being Jonathan Davis, my personal account, retweeted the show as well. So I don't count. Thank you, the 23. I so appreciate it. I have to say, we have to try and get 25 this week. I want to tell you that we had a steady increase in download numbers of the show throughout last year. It was an uptrend in technical analysis parlance, and it seems to me that the number of downloads has gone flat the last few weeks. I've absolutely, of course, no idea why that should be, especially because there's been a distinct increase in the number of retweets. We were only getting about 9 or 10 retweets. Then it jumped to 13. We got that 2 weeks in a row. Then 17. And last week, as I say, 23 of you beautifully retweeted the show and let other people know. It tells me, this is the feedback, it gives me great feedback. It tells me that you like what you hear and that you want it to continue. And, like any being, I say, I don't get paid to do this show. I get zero financial reward whatsoever. It takes up a day or so to do the show. There's no question I get a blast from doing it. I love doing it. No question about that. But it's a serious consideration every few months what I do with the show. And like any being, I respond to positivity. So it will make it easier for me to do this show for a long time if I'm getting an increased number of retweets and there's more and more people who come and find the show and download. I cannot be more honest and be fairer than that. Moving to quotes of the week. Of course, I did one earlier. And I need to tell you about a friend of mine who was talking to me last week. He has been married to the same wonderful woman for 15 years. And he told me that he always keeps her picture in his wallet. Isn't that lovely? And he says, you know, this is psychology, listener. I mean, this is grit and determination. Whenever I face difficulties, he told me, difficulties in life, challenges, when business isn't going well, or, you know, everything's just getting at me. He says, I take out of my wallet and I stare at her picture. And he tells me it comforts me knowing that if I can survive being in a relationship with that psychopath, I can survive anything. You know how socialists are always telling us all the money taken in taxes goes to help the poor and needy. As they say about the movies, there's really only 5 stories. Well, you know, there's loads of different ways you can say that, but basically that's what they're saying. All the money taken in taxes goes to help the poor and needy. Sure it does. Once all the politicians, the bureaucrats, the civil service, the special interest groups, the lobbyists, the executives, the enforcers get their cut. All the money taken in taxes goes to help the poor and needy. Now, Mark Twain said something intelligent. He said a lot of things intelligent, I can tell you. Go and look at his quotes. He said, if you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you read the newspaper, you're misinformed. And also on This Week in History, we had Burns Night, 25th of January, and in a couple of weeks, admittedly after the fact, the Davis family will hold, as we do every year, and we have done for 6 or 7 years, we will hold our own Burns Night. We will invite friends, old and new, to join with us. We put on the full Burns supper itinerary, the bagpipe music, tea haggis, the recitals. It's always a great event. And I want you to look at the picture there. In 1967, there is a man walking through Glasgow centre, taking his haggis, a tame haggis nonetheless, for a walk. It's a beautiful photo, and we should all learn from that. Now, how can you not love Ronald Reagan when he would say something like this? How do you tell a communist? Well, it's someone who reads Marx and Lenin. And how do you tell an anti-communist? It's someone who understands Marx and Lenin. The Holocaust Memorial Day, listener, is not simply a day of remembrance. It's a call to action. We must never again let the forces of hate, anti-Semitism, racism, and tyranny to take root in the free world. You want to know why I'm anti-socialist? Never forget. Never again. And I'm playing you out with Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem. I've had a blast, and I'll see you next week.